All right, welcome back, folks. Now we're talking about Chapter 11, Sexual Orientation. And some of this we did discuss a little bit about sexual orientation in Chapter 4. Just to sort of review and to scale that up a bit, we need to talk about and define sexual orientation. Sexual orientation refers to the sex or sexes that one is attracted to in four ways: physically, romantically, sexually, and emotionally. Now, notice we didn't say, or it's not simply a matter of, well, who did what to who, or who you were with last, or who you've been with mostly, or something like that. So keep in mind that, like we've discussed in the beginning of the course, wherein we've defined sexuality as being along a continuum, the same is certainly true for sexual orientation, that we really don't have a true dichotomous, true split between sexual orientations in terms of straight or gay. That quite frankly there are layers, there are gradations in between, and if you will, amongst different sexual orientations. And so we've shifted from thinking that it's dichotomous, one choice or another, on or off, so to speak. That quite frankly there's a great range of possibility and a great range of identification today and henceforth in terms of how we think about sexual orientation and the identities ultimately that are attached to a sexual orientation. When we think of straight folks or heterosexuals, heterosexuals are predominantly emotionally, physically, romantically, and sexually attracted to members of the opposite sex. Notice I said predominantly. That does allow for straight folks to have same-sex, overt same-sex experiences in terms of their attraction and their behavior. And so, quite frankly, we're looking at this being a true spectrum, a true range, a true continuum. So, if you will, a person may define themselves as straight or heterosexual, yet we don't have full knowledge of, or full, if you will, access to their sexual experiences, their fantasies, who they've fallen in love with. And so, that person may define themselves as straight, but they may have had a plethora of other experiences and other dimensionality in terms of their sexual orientation that we don't necessarily get to access, and that society doesn't really truly have much of an interest in, because although we're recognizing the fluidity of sexual orientation, quite frankly, we don't still break from that rigid pattern of straight or gay that much in terms of everyday discourse and everyday conversation. So in some ways, what we're doing in academia has moved a lot further than what we see in the pop culture, and in some ways pop culture too has also moved further than academia. So at some level, at some point throughout this class, and certainly this chapter is a good example of it, you may get lost within the categories and you might think, well, do they still have meaning? Does the category of straight, does the category of gay, does the category of bisexual truly mean what I think it does? And again, we're on a continuum. It's going to mean different things, have different dimensionality from one person to the next. So that's something to keep in mind as we talk about this, that nuance matters, that details indeed do matter. In terms of gay and lesbian folks are predominantly emotionally, physically, sexually, and romantically attracted to members of the same sex. And again, predominantly, because again, we don't get to see the entire maelstrom or range of a unique individual's sexual experiences, their fantasies, and what have you. We don't get to see that, what will be for the future for that person, what they've had or experienced in the past, and so forth. So, indeed, folks who think of themselves as gay or lesbian, they may have had a plethora of opposite sex overt sexual experiences that we don't necessarily access, that they don't necessarily detail when talking about their sexual orientation, but nevertheless, again, what the individual says about himself, what the individual says about herself is important, and that is incredibly necessary in terms of how we respect people based upon their sense of uniqueness and their sense of individuality. Bisexual folks are predominantly emotionally, physically, sexually, and romantically attracted to members of both sexes. And although that's the predominant pattern, it is often the case that folks may indeed be bisexual but in straight relationships. They may be bisexual but in gay relationships in terms of an intact monogamous kind of relationship. So again, the labels matter. They are indeed a starting point, but they won't necessarily encompass the full, complete totality of a person's experience or their sexual orientation, so to speak. Keep in mind also terminology, GLBT or LGBT, we're talking about members of the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered communities. Sometimes you'll see a Q added to it, and we've talked about this before with respect to gender. Queer as this sort of inclusive umbrella term that refers, if you will, to the entire range of what we often have thought of as sexual minority persons within our society. Again, we can't really truly reduce sexual orientation to either or, straight or gay. It's much more fluid, it's much more of a range, it's much more of a spectrum, and we talked about this from the very beginning of the semester. So the research of Alfred Kinsey was really pioneering in this respect, in that a lot of the research that he did right after the Second World War really asked and attempted to gather notions of sexual orientation, how many gay folks, how many straight folks, how many bisexual folks. A lot of what he did went to get after those kinds of questions. And he realized that, quite frankly, people were admitting to a great variety of sexual behavior. They may have outwardly lived and thought of themselves as straight. They may have outwardly lived or thought of themselves as gay, but they had often, a lot of folks who responded in surveys in kind had a range, a plethora of experiences that didn't really truly fit the pattern of straight, didn't really truly fit this notion traditionally of how we think of as gay or lesbian. And so that's where we started to see within the literature and in Kinsey's work that, quite frankly, you really couldn't reduce sexual orientation to simply either or, straight or gay. People can say straight, people can say gay, but quite frankly, no two straights are straight the same way, no two gay folks are straight or rather gay in the same way. So we have to kind of think about that and not take the truth, if you will, of what someone says with a grain of salt, but realize that there's much more nuance and much more specificity from one person to another. And as great as what Kinsey did was, Fritz Klein, the researcher, also in this vein came along years later and said, you know what, Kinsey was a great starting point, but there's more. We have to look at past, we have to look at present, we have to look at what people idealize for the future. We have to also look at who they're attracted to, who they fall in love with, who they interact with, and what they say. How do they describe their sexual orientation? How do they describe themselves? And so Klein, his model allowed for even greater fluidity and greater dimensionality. And so that's one of the things that we have to keep in mind with respect to this chapter. Some have wondered, well, what are the reasons for unique and different sexual orientations? Why do we have them? What explains them, so to speak? And there are two basic sort of schools of thought. There are the essentialist theories that say that there is some fundamental difference between gay folks and straight folks, and that much of this is rooted in biology. There's a really good example of this, if you will, theoretically, but also in terms of practical research, birth order studies. And so a whole host of studies, particularly looking at male offspring, have demonstrated that in, if you will, families, households of all male offspring, that the younger men, let's say if you have 3 boys or 4 or 5, in those younger, if you will, later births, those later born boys are more likely to be gay. And so research has definitely shown that. And so not in every family that's constructed this way, but there is a greater association with a family of all boys having younger boys, later born boys, who think of themselves as gay. And so it does suggest that there is perhaps a genetic component to, if you will, gay or lesbian identity, but particularly for men in particular in this case. So actually I should edit that. The birth order studies don't hold up for all-girl families or all-girl offspring. So we haven't seen that in the case of lesbians. But at the same time, we have seen some association, if you will, in terms of the birth order studies. And so it allows folks to think, well, maybe there is some genetic component. However, it's not all about what happens in terms of genes and DNA and so forth. If that's the case, if that was the case, then we would have seen, if you will, gay and lesbian identities and realities pass out of the gene pool. Often, in this case, gays and lesbians are less likely to have their own biological children. So we wouldn't see it come up, if you will, if it was only purely something or an instance of biology. And then that leads us to the constructionist theories that say that ultimately what we do in society is we have labels that we apply to people and apply to their behavior, and ultimately we've seen the same, if you will, amount of same-sex overt sexual behavior throughout history. We've just come up with different labels. We've come up with different ways to describe, if you will, these different identities. Identities have power. Identities have power that is attached to labels. And again, throughout history, there wasn't, throughout the majority of history, much interest in gay or lesbian identity, if you will, as it compared to straight or heterosexual identity. Particularly if we look at the time of Christ, if we look at the ancient civilizations, there wasn't really much interest. There wasn't a real sense of gay or lesbian identity, if you will. And there often weren't, if you will, there wasn't judgment directed to folks who expressed themselves in same-sex terms, in terms of their attraction and their overt behavior. And we saw that in the case of the ancient Greeks and Romans earlier in the course. As the Industrial Revolution occurred and as society became more complex, we saw roles particularly become much more rigidly defined for both men and women. And so gender roles becoming much more rigidly defined as the Industrial Revolution was ushered in, women being in the home and in the community, men being in the economy and the workplace. That rigidity in many cases ratcheted up the judgment and the prohibitions directed towards gay and lesbian behavior and gay and lesbian identities. And of course we've seen an incredible movement and resistance to that rejection for quite some time in our society, arguably starting with the Stonewall riots in New York in 1969, and even, if you will, coming out of the HIV and AIDS epidemic. So much of the gains medically also from that process of fighting on behalf and for gays and lesbians in particular, in terms of fighting for AIDS funding, AIDS research, and to stop the spread of the virus and the disease within the gay and lesbian community. The long-fought battles within that also have added to much of what we see today in terms of the acceptance, the more accepting environment and the more tolerant environment that we have with respect to gay and lesbian identity and non-judgmentalism. Not that we're where we need to be, but we've made incredible movement. The media has been a powerful influence in that change, that shift of attitudes and behaviors towards gays and lesbians, and particularly social media. And so we've seen an incredible sea change over time with respect to identity and how we think about sexual orientation in addition to gender identity as well. So this is a great chapter for that, and we've seen enormous change, not just in the media, but we've also seen legal change accompany a lot of what we see in the culture. So for instance, 5 years ago this July, for instance, we saw the Supreme Court support and allow and permit for same-sex marriage throughout the entire 50 states. And so we had not seen that before throughout the entire country at any point in our history. Again, individual states since 2004, starting with Massachusetts and California, allowed for this to occur. And again, over and over again, successive court decisions were made, and the ultimate decision with the Supreme Court 5 years ago has gotten us to this point.